He's such a cutie. Hello, hello. How is everybody today? I hope you are all doing well. Yes, hello, hello. So, today, as you might know, we're doing something a tad different. So, last night I started reading a book to those who were in chat. By their request, I did a poll. I didn't. That's good. I'm glad you are, Bunny. A book, yes. A book that is very near and dear to my heart that inspired me a lot growing up, called Margret and the Moth Tree. Oh shoot, that is unfortunate. But yes, it is a book that is near and dear to my heart, and we started reading it. Yeah. Yep, it is a book near and dear to my heart. I read it when I was about 10 for the first time. And it inspired me to this day. It is about a little girl who ends up in an orphanage, where she discovers the secrets of moths. So we're gonna do a recap since I read about half the book yesterday. It's not a very long book. But when she was about 1.5, her parents died in a car accident. And so she was taken in by her cousin Amos. Now, Amos was not a very good child caretaker. He didn't speak much. He gave her, yeah, he gave her the bare necessities, but one thing she learned how to do while living with Amos. That is so fair, Sakura. You are sick. You are allowed to sleep. But the one thing she learned at Amos's house was she learned how to listen. Due to how quiet it was. I will, and I hope everybody else does too. But while she was living with Amos, she learned how to listen, and she learned how to listen to all the quiet things of the world that no one else gets to hear because they're too busy being loud. So she learned how to listen, like some of the descriptions where she learned how to listen to the shadows creep across the floorboards and the sun rays coming through the windows in the morning. But eventually, after a few years, Amos dies. So she goes to live with her great aunt Linda, who is a very loud woman. Hi, Victor. And while living, I don't know why I am broken. Hello? Can I fix? Oh, Jesus. I don't know what that was all about. What is happening right now? Alright. I think I fixed it. Alright. But she went to go live with her great aunt Linda, who was a very loud woman, and in the process, Margret forgot how to listen, as her life was so filled with noise that when she tried to listen for the quiet things, they were just too hard to hear. So when great aunt Linda died a few years later, Margret had no living relatives left and was sent off to the Hopton orphanage. Upon arriving to the Hopton orphanage, she thought it was a dream come true. The matron was a lovely woman. Everything was beautiful and the kids seemed happy. Until the ladies of the CLC, which stands for the Concerned Ladies Club, but as soon as the ladies of the Concerned Ladies Club who dropped her off at the orphanage left, everything changed. The matron, known as Miss Switch, this is a child's book, turned cold and malicious, blew a whistle, and all the kids scattered to get rid of all the fineries. Hid them away until the next time they would be needed to keep up appearances. Where she then revealed herself as quite an abusive woman. After a couple weeks of enduring Miss Switch's behavior, Margret got the idea to call the cops. So, one day, while she is being watched over by one of the other orphans, known as a pet, there's two groups of orphans, the dregs and the pets, chosen purely based off of appearance when they get to the orphanage. If they're beautiful, they're a pet. If they're less so, they're a dreg. Fair enough. But yeah, so when she was being watched over, one of the pets, known as the Dregish pet, the girl named Agatha decides to go into the pantry because she's feeling bad about herself being the worst looking pet. Lots of trauma going on with these children. And considering Agatha's no older than, like, 13, maybe? There's a lot going on. Margret sneaks away to call the cops. So she does so, but Agatha finds out and tells the Switch. Yeah. So in retaliation, as Miss Switch had time to put up the front once again, Margret was punished by essentially having her existence erased. She was not allowed to speak, and no one was allowed to speak to her under severe threat of punishment. So, that's what she's been dealing with. And she's been doing this for, what, a week now, I think? A week or a couple of days. I can't remember exactly how long. But, now that she's living her life in silence once again, because she's not even allowed to be around the other kids, her bed was moved out into the hall, and she has to eat her meals outside. She's not even allowed to be in the same room as the other kids, unless absolutely necessary. But now that she's living her life in silence again, she's begun to listen again, hearing the small things. As it's a skill she never really lost, it just hid itself away for a while. So one night while she's out in the garden, she hears a small voice. And upon investigating, she doesn't find anything. But that night, curiosity pulls her back, and she goes back outside. And she listens again, and she hears the voice again. She finds a small opening in a big brush that is just off the orphanage's property. And inside, she finds a beautiful tree. And she discovers that this tree houses a colony of moths. And she has spent the night awake talking to said moths. And that is where we left off because it was like 4:30 a.m. and I decided to go to bed. But that is also where we'll be picking up. This is literally right after her first encounter with the moths. So we're gonna put on, because we had this going last night. I was about to say, it better not be any fucking ads. I got YouTube Premium. And we're just gonna keep the same vibes from last night. We we got some good old lullabies going. And we got nice campfire sounds. And we shall continue the book. Chapter 17. Sanctuary. The Margaret Grey who climbed back into bed was not the same Margaret Grey who had snuck away from the orphanage in the dead of night a few short hours before. Even though her eyes were still tired, her clothes were still grey and scratchy, and her stomach still hungry, Margaret had changed on the inside. Now she had a secret, which was something Switch couldn't take away from her. From that day onward, Margaret crept out from her bed every night and ran softly out of the orphanage to meet with Pip and the other moths. And in those few wonderful hours before she collapsed back to sleep, she could forget about her life of drudgery. "It's Margaret of the orphanage!" Pip would cry when he saw her coming, and he and the other moths would welcome her into the tree as if she were a very large and distant cousin. Margaret's secret made her daytime hours more bearable, too. Even as she was forced to use a moldy toothbrush to scrape gunk out from between the kitchen tiles, she imagined she was crawling through the thorny tunnel to the moth tree. Even as she forced a spoonful of cold mush into her mouth, she remembered the taste of the tangy purple flurples, which are blueberries. Moths call them flurples. And even as she spent hours beating dust out of curtains with a large racket, she imagined she was talking with Pip, and everything seemed much better. Any place you can go to escape from the pinches and punishments of the world is called a sanctuary, and this is just what Margaret had found in the moth tree. But the trouble with sanctuaries is that sooner or later you have to leave them. One blustery morning when Margaret was put on mush-making duty in the kitchen, something happened that pulled her out of hers. Mush-making was a particularly boring chore that involved big bricks of packed oats, squishing them in a bowl and pouring warm water into them and making the tasteless mush that was served to the dregs at mealtime. Margaret was sitting on a small stool, squishing oats and thinking of the previous night's game of hoverpick, when an enormous crash shattered the silence in the kitchen. Looking over, she saw a terrified, red-haired girl holding a silver tray and standing over a mess of broken china. "You clumsy lunkhead!" shouted Lacey, who appeared a moment later in the hall. "You've done it now! Miss Switch will have your skin for this!" Grabbing the girl by one ear, she dragged her out of the room. Lacey is one of the favorite pets. Margaret and the other children followed, keeping a safe distance. When they reached the front hall, Lacey began to shriek at the top of her lungs up the stairs. "Miss Switch! Miss Switch, come quickly!" After a few moments, a door opened somewhere on the upper floor, and Miss Switch swept into view at the top of the staircase. "Lacey, dear," she said, eyes gleaming, "what have I told you about shouting?" "This dreg ruined your china tea set, Miss Switch," Lacey said quickly, shoving the red-haired girl forward. "The stupid scab smashed it." Switch shot an icy glare at the unfortunate girl. "Sarah Potley, isn't it?" Her voice grew horribly quiet. "This isn't the first time we've suffered from your buffoonery." A dead silence fell across the room, and all eyes turned to Switch. I'm sorry," Sarah was spluttering, her eyes wide with terror. I'm so sorry." Miss Switch raised one perfectly manicured finger, and the girl fell silent. "I think, my dear," she said, gliding slowly down the stairs, "that you need to be taught a lesson." "Please," begged Sarah Potley, her whole body trembling. "Please, no." Miss Switch smiled a terrible smile. "But my dear child," she said, her voice mocking and sickly sweet, "how else will you get anything through that thick head of yours?" Darting down the remaining stairs and grasping the trembling girl by the arm, "Come along, children. We're going up." With a few strides of her long legs, Switch pulled the unfortunate Sarah Potley up the stairs and around the corner. I read this book when I was Margaret's age. Keep that in mind.
No, God! No, God, please, no! No!
Switch pulled the unfortunate Sarah Potley up the stairs and around the corner. The other children ran to keep up as she strode down the hall, past the orphans' bedrooms and up another flight of stairs. Where's she going? Margret heard someone whisper behind her. The attic, answered Judy. Oh no, another boy gasped. Not the window! Spanning the attic wall was an enormous window, which Switch threw open to reveal the steep drop down to the yard below. A strong, cold wind came whipping in. Still smiling her malicious smile, the matron pushed Sarah Potley towards the open window. Now, Switch hissed with delight. Out you go, Dreg. Shaking uncomfortably, Sarah took a step forward, then turned back in fear. Please, she begged. Don't make me. You have to learn, my dear, the dangers of smashing things to smithereens on the ground, Switch said, when the girl still didn't move. Switch raised her voice to a terrible pitch and shouted, Out! Bursting into tears, Sarah took one shaky step, then another, then reached out a hand to grab hold of the windowsill and hoist herself onto the ledge. Almost there, Switch said, and with a very sudden thrust, she pushed Sarah over the ledge. The children gasped and Sarah screamed as she plummeted out the window. No! Margret barely stopped herself from crying aloud, but when she rushed forward with the rest of the children to peer over the sill, she saw that Sarah had landed on a small ledge that jutted out from the building. Pull me back, Sarah cried, her frizzy red hair whipping in the strong wind. Please, I'm going to slip. You should be fine if you hold very still, Switch said gleefully, and keep your stupid mouth shut. The wind is too strong, Sarah shouted, and Margret could see that powerful gusts were pushing and pulling at the frantic girl, making her sway alarmingly. Don't be so dramatic, Switch said, her smile widening. Oh yeah, it's bad. It's real bad. I think this is the perfect place for you to stand quietly and think about what you've done. Margret looked around the attic and saw that the other orphans were watching Sarah's plight in helpless silence. Please, Sarah Potley's voice cried again. Somebody help! But for poor Sarah Potley, there was no help to be found. There was only the Switch. Turning back to the horrified children, the matron beckoned Lacey to her side. You can let her in, the Switch said, her voice cool. After sundown. Yes, Miss Switch. Lacey gave a small curtsy as Miss Switch swept back down the stairs. Then, with a satisfied glare at the rest of the children, Lacey pulled the window shutters closed with a bang. Back to work, dregs! She snarled, shoving them down the attic stairs. Back to work they went, quiet and fearful, and for the rest of the day they tried in vain to ignore the cries of distress that drifted down from the attic. Even Margret, with her secret supply of happy thoughts, couldn't block out the distant screams. Sarah Potley's torment had intruded on her sanctuary. Margaret's heart filled with sadness at each pitiful wail, because while Margret was lucky enough to have a wonderful secret all of her own, she knew Sarah Potley had nothing to distract herself from the thought of being smashed to smithereens. This quality is one of the basic ways to spot good people with kind hearts. It is called sympathy, and people who have it make up for all the bullies of this world, who feel nothing at all. Chapter 18, A Run of Bad Luck. When Margret ran to the moth tree that night, she could barely contain the awful feelings that had stayed with her all throughout the day. Bursting through the tunnel of the brush, she told Pippa exactly what Switch had done to poor Sarah Potley. That stink beetle! That swindle swine! He cried, zipping around in a fury. Margret nodded grimly. Switch had spent the afternoon catching up on her reading, reclining in a silk chase with a large stack of fashion magazines. To all appearances, she was completely unmoved by the cries of fear that drifted down from above, her only reaction to each unfortunate dreg's wail being a casual flip of a glossy page. How many chapters? 32, but each chapter's only actually like a page and a half. Maybe 2.5 pages at most. They're very short chapters. It's a very short book. Fix myself because I have to angle myself properly to read. around my mic. As Margaret described the whole of that dreadful day, Pip grew very quiet, his wings twitching as though he were about to fly off for a game of Billabump. "Dung waddler!" he cried instead. "That's what she is!" He flitted around the tree, hurling more and more insults at the absent Switch, until Margaret grinned in spite herself. Calling the matron names was something Margaret had never thought she would do, as Great Aunt Linda had taught her to never criticize her elders. But when dealing with an elder who was also a terrifying bully, a good bout of name-calling can be a useful exercise. This is because, as soon as you can laugh at the thing you've been afraid of, you begin to whittle away at its fearsomeness. The more insults Pip hurled at Switch, the less gloomy Margaret's mood became. Her grin grew into a wide smile, and her smile burst into a giggle, and soon, in the very spot in her mind where her fear of Switch had been, Margaret found that there was no fear at all. In its place was something she hadn't felt in a very long time. A glimmering bit of hope. Sometimes, improving things just a little makes a great deal of difference. It occurred to Margaret that if the other orphans could only laugh, perhaps they too would be a little less afraid. Perhaps the gloom of Hopeton Orphanage could be broken, if even just for a moment. And as Margaret imagined grins and smiles on the faces of the other orphans, she knew just what would make them smile the most. There was one person who deserved to be laughed at more than others, the same person who had laughed at each of them so often, the same person who had tricked and taunted and tortured them, and kept every good thing to herself. Margaret decided it was time for things to change, and she thought she knew exactly how to manage it. "Magazines," she said aloud. "What's that?" said Pip. A great and clever plan had formed in Margaret's head. Each morning, after breakfast, Miss Switch would go into her study and read a stack of fashion magazines. And every time she opened a shiny new magazine, she always flipped right to the back to check the horoscopes. A horoscope, in case you didn't know, is an extremely vague piece of advice given from one perfect stranger to another. While any reasonable person knows to pay horoscopes no attention at all, gullible people will still always obey them no matter how silly their advice may be. It is well known among the orphans, that the Switch took her horoscopes very seriously, and it was this fact that formed the basis of Margaret's great and clever plan. Before the night was through, she had crept up to Switch's study and scooped a large stack of old magazines. She sacrificed her few hours of sleep to search through the horoscopes with Pip, and by sunrise they had found exactly the ones they needed. Tearing out the pages very carefully, Margaret tucked them into the sleeve of her dress. When the mailman arrived that morning, leaving Switch's new magazines on the front doorstep, Margaret was there to snatch them up. She clipped out the horoscope pages, and with the glue that Switch sometimes used to stick children's hands together, she pasted the old ones in their place. The first horoscope read, "Bad luck awaits if little things distract you." The second one said, "See a penny, pick it up." And the last horoscope said, "Climb to the highest peak." These were the messages that Switch read in her study that day, after Margaret had replaced the glossy magazines on the doorstep. And Miss Switch, who was always on the lookout for bad luck, read them 3 times over. It just so happened that her peaceful reading was interrupted very suddenly by a loud clattering noise outside her study door. When Switch threw the door open, she saw tiny Timothy Smealing struggling with a large tray of noisy dishes. "The little things," she hissed, remembering her horoscope and realizing with horror that she had been distracted by one. "Lacey!" she shrieked. "Dregs, listen up! If I hear so much as a peep or see so much of a finger from any of you today, I'll tie your feet to the ceiling like mistletoe and leave you there for a week. I don't want to be distracted by a single one of you. Is that understood?" "Yes, Miss Switch," claimed the children. "Was that a peep?" screeched the Switch. "I can still see you." Without another word, the children bolted from sight. Miss Switch sighed. "Much better," she said to no one. Don't any of you show your spotty faces until tomorrow morning, or else. None of the orphans made even the smallest sound in response. The rest of the day consisted of a great deal of hiding and shushing among the orphans as Miss Switch moved through different rooms of the house. Nothing interesting happened until just after dinner time, when Miss Switch went upstairs for a soak in her private bathtub. The children who had been hiding in the kitchen slowly came out from behind their curtains and cupboards and began quietly preparing their dinners of cold mush. But Margret was doing something else. She was waiting just outside Switch's bedroom door, holding a small handful of pennies she'd collected from the crow's nests in the brush. When she heard the matron's footsteps approaching, she placed a single, shiny penny just outside Switch's door and sprinted down the hall in the direction of the attic. When Switch reached the top of the stairs, her eyes fell on the penny. She snatched it up greedily, remembering her horoscope. And just as she did so, she noticed another penny, lying only a few feet away. "How delightful!" she said aloud, feeling sure that if one penny was good luck, two would be even better. She picked up the second penny, only to spot another tiny glint further down the hallway by the attic stairs. She was just pocketing the third penny when another caught the light a few stairs up. Switch followed the trail of pennies, feeling both incredibly lucky and vaguely surprised that she had never noticed so many pennies lying around before. Then she came to a penny in the middle of the attic floor. It seemed to be the last one, and it was sitting next to the ladder that led up to the roof. Margret, who was watching from behind a dusty old wardrobe, held her breath to see if the last part of her plan would work. Switch looked to the right, then the left, then directly behind her, and then she remembered what her last horoscope had said. Climb to the highest peak. She looked up. The trapdoor roof was directly above her head. It had a long string attached to the handle so that you could pull the door closed from inside. The string was swaying slowly back and forth in a draft of cold air. Without a moment's thought, Miss Switch climbed up the ladder and pushed open the trapdoor. Leaving Margaret's shoulder, Pip flew after the matron as she stepped onto the windy roof and began scanning for pennies. The moment her back was turned to the trapdoor, he zipped back inside. "Now!" he cried. Miss Switch, of course, couldn't hear him, but Margret could. She dashed across the attic to the ladder, climbed up it, and yanked hard on the dangling string. The trapdoor came slamming down with a bang, but Margret slid the latch that locked it from the inside. The switch was trapped, and Margret darted back to her hiding place. She could hear the matron screaming to be let back in. When the other orphans began tiptoeing up to the attic to see what all the ruckus was about, Margret stepped from behind the wardrobe and blended into the back of the growing crowd. "You dreg!" Lacey hissed, pointing at Judy. "Go up there and see what Miss Switch wants." "She said she didn't want to see us," Judy said, shaking her head. "She said she'd hang us up like mistletoe." And though Lacey kept trying to get the dregs to open the door, she didn't dare do it herself for fear of disobeying Miss Switch's orders. It was a very satisfying thing to see people get a taste of their own medicine, even though Switch screamed like a banshee all through the rainy night, and even though her fancy gown was soaked through, and even though the next morning she was hacking and sneezing with a terrible cold, there was no one for her to punish. They had all, as Lacey explained nervously when she let Switch in, only been following the matron's own command. By mid-morning chores, the tale had become very popular. "The whole night," whispered Vikram Skitter. "In the rain," whispered Phoebe Frizzleton. "In her evening dress," giggled Bessie Blotchy. What a last name. Blotchy. The rooftop story was told again and again, and every time it brought little smiles to the faces of the orphans. And early the next morning when the mailman came by, he wondered why the trash cans were so full of magazines. Chapter 19. The Nibblers. When Margaret Gray was growing up, she had all the exciting firsts that all the other children should have. It was the first time she read a book by herself, the first time she tied her own shoes, and the first time she wrote the alphabet in cursive letters. But every time Margaret did one of these clever things and toddled to inform her aunt, Great Aunt Linda would tell her not to blow her own horn. This had confused Margret at first, said she couldn't play the horn or any other musical instrument. What Great Aunt Linda had meant was that small children shouldn't brag about their accomplishments. Bragging and boasting and blowing your own horn all meant the same thing, no matter what you call it. It was a thing young Margret was never allowed to do. When the rooftop plot went off without a hitch, Margret felt enormously happy and relieved. But even if she hadn't been forbidden to speak to the other orphans, it never would have occurred to her to blow her own horn. "It's What's-It!" cried Flit, when Margret crawled through the tunnel to the moth tree the following night. "Margret?" came Pip's voice from up in the tree. "Hello," Margret called, climbing up to him. As she settled herself on a sturdy branch, letting her legs dangle, she saw that Pip was surrounded by a group of moths. They all seemed excited to be waiting for her, and they all looked very excited. "Margret's here. Let's hear the story. She's my Margret," Pip said importantly, taking his place on her shoulder. "So I'll be the one to ask. Tell the story, Margret." Contrary to Great Aunt Linda's idea of correct manners, in the moth world, blowing your own horn was not at all impolite. In fact, it was expected. After a round of bullabump or light hopping or whirlawomps, moths would sit around and brag about their brilliance for hours on end. A good boaster is highly respected, because in the moth world, boasting is really like a game in and of itself. Encouraged by Pip, Margret launched into the tale of Switch on the Roof. As she told her story, the crowd of moths grew that soon the entire tree had gathered near her. "Nicely played," said a moth called Milla-Wisp when she came to the end. "Well snuck," said a moth called Putterwing. "I was there too," said Pip. He was just explaining the important role he played with the trapdoor when he stopped speaking very suddenly. He was perfectly still for several seconds, and then his wings began to twitch. "What's wrong?" said Margret. Looking around, she noticed that all the other moths had frozen too, their wings quivering with the energy just like Pip's. Then everyone began talking all at once. "They're back! Good nibblers tonight!" "What's going on?" said Margret. "Can't you smell them?" said Pip. Margret sniffed the air, but all she could smell was the pleasant mossy scent of the green dome. She frowned and looked back at Pip, but he was gone. In seconds, the tree had come alive with moths flying up from every branch. They zipped away through the branches to the outside, until only Margret and the caterpillars were left. Margret jumped down from her branch and scrambled through the tunnel. When she emerged on the grass, the moths were shouting and laughing together in a great, busy cloud. "I smell a good one! Quick, catch it! Tasty!" High in the air, the moths looped and zigzagged in unison as if they were all chasing some invisible thing. Margret gazed up at the beautiful sight, watching in wonder for several minutes. She was still trying to make out what the game was, when a strange chase ended as suddenly as it had begun. The pattern broke apart, and one by one, the moths turned to head back to the tree. "What was that all about?" asked Margret, and Pip fluttered down to sit on her shoulder. "Didn't you see the nibblers?" said Pip, as if she ought to know what that meant. "They were delicious tonight." Margret shrugged. "What's a nibbler?" "Don't you know?" She shook her head. "How funny! A nibbler is, well, it's a sort of shimmery cloud thing. You have to be nimbler than it is if you want to catch it." "You eat them?" said Margret. "What else would we do with them?" said Pip. "They're scrumptious. Much better than nectar." "What do they taste like?" "Oh, all sorts of things. Honey and pine cones and berries and cinnamon and licorice and peppermint." Uncoiling his straw-like tongue, Pip made a hungry slurping noise. Margret felt her own mouth watering. "We hadn't had a good one in ages, only rotten ones. Those kinds make you sick. Then last night, when I got back from your orphanage, the sky was full of tasty ones, and again tonight." "I still don't understand," she said. "What are they?" "Well, they come from your head, don't they?" "They what?" cried Margret. "You know," Pip said. "Humans and dogs and bears and creatures like that. They come from your head when you're deep asleep. When you're tossing and turning and muttering to yourself." "Oh," Margret said slowly. "Do you mean a dream?" "I don't know," said Pip. "Do they float up and dance around the air?" I didn't think they did, said Margret, feeling rather amazed. But of course, it's nearly impossible to watch yourself sleeping, as anyone who has tried will know. Even if you could watch yourself sleep, you still wouldn't be able to see what the moths see. Margret had discovered, at last, the most important truth about moths. They are good at games and good at doing nothing at all. They are good at being happy and good at laughing. They are skilled boasters and they are wonderfully good listeners. But all of the wonderful truths about them, the most wonderful thing is this. They are the only creatures to know the colors and tastes of dreams. Chapter 20. The Pettish Dreg. Miss Switch had ordered that no one was permitted to speak of her night on the rooftop ever again. And yet, to her deep annoyance, she had a strange suspicion that her orders were being disobeyed. She couldn't help but notice that there was altogether too much giggling and smiling going on, too much disgusting cheeriness. It simply wouldn't do. Try as she might to forget her humiliation, every giggle and grin was a tiny reminder of the rain-soaked rooftop, and these reminders put her in a very foul mood indeed. As you know, Switch liked to divide the world neatly into two groups, those with her own divine good looks and those without. You also know that she always judged people based on first impressions. What you have yet to know, however, is that just as the existence of the draggish pet Agatha Spink had always nagged at the back of Switch's mind, there was also a pettish dreg in the orphanage whose presence unnerved her even more. Helen Ravish was a sweet-tempered girl with very long, lovely hair. But on the day she arrived at the Hopetoun orphanage, her mouth had sprouted cold sores, her long hair was a matted nest, and her eyes were bright red from crying over the loss of her parents. So, it was only fitting that Switch had thrown her in with the rest of the dregs. But the problem was, Helen Ravish was rather nice-looking now, even nicer than many of the pets. This complicated things terribly for Switch, who couldn't help but admire Helen's lovely hair, but was never able to admit it. Helen had no way of knowing just how much her lovely hair irked the matron, and she had no way of knowing that wearing her hair in a beautiful plaited braid was the worst thing she could have possibly done after Switch's ordeal on the roof. But just because you have no way of knowing something doesn't mean you won't get walloped for it. 2 days after the embarrassment of the rooftop, Helen was sent upstairs with a basket of ribbons and bows, which she carried into the Switch's private sitting room. Lacey and 2 other pets were on sewing duty, pinning in the seam of a dress, and Miss Switch, who was in the dress, happened to look down just as Helen entered the room. "Scat, dreg," mumbled Lacey, who had a needle between her teeth. Helen set down the basket and turned to leave. "What a lovely braid, Helen," heard Miss Switch. "Thank you," said Helen very quietly. "It looks quite pretty, don't you think?" "Yes," said Helen, and then she clapped her hand over her mouth, realizing what she had just said. "So," said the Switch, "you think you look pretty then? You think that a dreg like you is allowed to be pretty?" No, I don't," said Helen, beginning to tremble. Switch took a step forward, knocking the pets and their sewing needles to the ground. She looked into Helen's frightened eyes, and Helen saw the matron's face darken like an angry thundercloud. "You probably think you're quite fashionable," said the Switch very quietly, reaching a hand into the sewing basket, removing a pair of long silver scissors. Then, in one swift moment, she grabbed Helen's braid, and with a sudden, violent snips, she chopped off all of Helen's lovely hair, right to the scalp. "That's much better," she said, nudging Helen toward the mirror. "Much more suitable for a dreg." Helen cried out as she caught a look at her reflection. All that was left of her lovely hair were a few spiky tufts that stuck out in all directions. Lacey, whose hair was rather stringy, who had always secretly envied the dreg, shrieked with delight. Miss Switch smiled at the smile of a bully happy to be back in practice. "Dregs really don't know much about fashion, do they?" she said in her sweetest purr, handing Helen the limp braid. "No, Miss Switch," Helen whispered through tears. The deep braiding of Helen Ravish was just the effect on the orphans that Switch wanted. The giggles hushed, the smiles faded away, and the atmosphere of fear returned. Things were just as dreadful as they had been before. But Margret wasn't fearful. Just as soon as she could, she raced out to the moth tree to tell Pip what had happened. "That wally-skag!" Pip cried angrily as Margret finished her tale. Margret nodded in agreement. Some people, when faced with a series of defeats, might choose to turn tail and put thoughts of victory behind them. But whether it was Pip's indignation or an anger all her own, Margret was determined not to let the switch get away with the things she had done. If your parents have any taste in bedtime stories, you may have heard about a green-capped bandit called Robin Hood, and how he stole things from rich people to give them away to the poor. On the surface, Robin Hood was just a very famous robber, but since those he stole from were thieves themselves, most people thought he deserved a pat on the back rather than a prison sentence. Like stealing from thieves, whether it is right or wrong to seek revenge against a bully really depends on how you look at it. And as Margret crept down the basement stairs that night, with Pip on her shoulder and a new plan brewing in her mind, she looked at her task as a very noble one indeed. With Pip flying ahead to check that the coast was clear, she made her way down the stairs to a storage room deep under the orphanage. "Just a little should do it," said Margret to Pip, as they peered into the large sack of powder that was used to mix dyes for the orphan's clothes. Then, reaching her hand into the sack, she drew out a handful of fine gray powder. Chapter 21. A Touch of Gray. Apart from thinking up creative new ways to terrorize dregs, Switch spent her days in a very... literally slowly falling asleep. Yeah, that's kind of the vibe I've literally set up. Just a comfy vibe. The Switch spent her ways in a very particular way. The first thing she was most particular about was her toilette. Fuck, I can't remember how to read French. Which is a French word for spending a ridiculous amount of time in front of a mirror trying to make yourself look attractive. Switch made her toilette in an enormous bathroom with mirrors from floor to ceiling, which was full of hundreds of combs and brushes, bottles, vials, tubes, jars, and pots. All morning long, a procession of pets went in and out, working to prink and preen and prettify her. Her creamy skin was rinsed and powdered, her golden hair was lathered and brushed. Her makeup alone took over 2 hours. Every single inch of her, from the top of her head to the tips of her toenails, had its own special treatment. What she looked like without the many layers of powder and makeup, no one knew. On delivery days, the mailman would bring boxes of fresh beauty supplies to the orphanage, and Lacey and another pet called Emily Darlington would unpack them in Switch's bathroom. The boxes were labeled for the foundlings, which made the mailman think they contained clothes and books and toys for the dear poor orphans. What a very kind woman, he always said to himself as he continued on his rounds. Little did he know that that very kind woman was having her toenails filed by a poor dear orphan while sipping on a cocktail and reading about the latest trends in handbags. As it happened, the day after debraiding of Helen Ravish was a delivery day. "Look what you've done, dolt!" Lacey yelled as she unpacked the boxes that morning. "Sorry, oopsie," chirped Emily Darlington. Emily, with her bouncing blonde ringlets and rosy cheeks, was perhaps the most adorable child in the whole orphanage, but she was also one of the dimmest. She had been midway through refilling Switch's shampoo bottle when she had stopped to stare at a crystal vial of perfume on the countertop. The light from the bathroom window shone into the crystal, casting little rainbows around the room. "Ooh, pretty," Emily had murmured, letting the shampoo run into her lap and onto the bathroom floor. "You're the most doltish dolt in the whole stinking place," Lacey shouted. "I'm sorry, Lacey. Clean up this mess, and you can finish these boxes yourself." Lacey called Emily a dolt a few more times for good measure, then stomped out of the room to find a dreg to pick on. This was Lacey's favorite way to do chores, as she preferred to take credit for other people's work if it was done well and punish them if it was not. Emily sat and looked around at all the work she had to do, biting her tongue between her teeth like a kitten. A few moments later, Margret appeared. Neither Lacey nor the doltish Emily had noticed Pip keeping watch from the windowsill, waiting for a moment just like this one. And Margret, her talented ears listening for his call, had hurried to the bathroom just as Lacey left. "Hello," said Margret, stepping in between two tall mirrors so that her reflection multiplied all around the mirrored room. "Hello," said Emily, jumping to her feet. "Wait." She wrinkled her brow in confusion. "I'm not supposed to talk to dregs." "You're not talking to a dreg," said Margret. "I'm not," said Emily, arching a pretty pointed eyebrow. "No, dregs aren't allowed in here. I'm your reflection." "Oh." Emily looked around at all the Margrets. She raised her right arm above her head slowly, and Margret did the exact same thing with her left. "Fun!" cried Emily, continuing the game with her other hand. Margret mirrored the pet's movements for a minute or so, collapsing to the ground convincingly when Emily tried to lift both her little feet in the air at the same time. "Not the brightest, is she?" said Pip, and Margret tried not to smile. "What are all of those?" Margret asked when she and Emily had righted themselves, pointing to the jars and bottles all over the floor. "These are Miss Switch's." "Yes, but what are they for?" "Well, this one's hand cream, this one's face powder, this one's hair tonic, and..." But the pet broke off. At a very small nod from Margret, tinkling music started to play from a beautiful ballerina box on the counter. "Oh, pretty," said Emily. She skipped towards it, her blonde curls bobbing. If you had been in Switch's bathroom, you would have seen Pip flying away from the music box lever and a quick movement of Margret's hand over the bottle of hair tonic. At the very moment, Emily turned away. But Emily, bless her, saw nothing but the graceful twirls of the clockwork ballet dancer. When the dancer stopped spinning for a few minutes later, and Emily Darlington returned to her boxes and bottles, the mysterious reflection was gone. Unconcerned, Emily went about her work and soon forgot about the whole encounter, save for the song of the music box ballerina, which she continued to hum for the rest of the day. The next morning, however, the residents of the Hopeton orphanage were awoken by an ear-splitting, spine-chilling, blood-curdling cry of rage. "Ah!" The dregs heard it and sat bolt right up in their beds. The pets heard it and sat bolt upright in theirs. The mouth of every orphan fell open and stayed frozen that way, because the Switch was yelling as they had never heard her yell before. Even Margret, with her finely tuned listening, could only make out the odd word like treachery, bottle, and vengeance. After one long, drawn-out scream from Switch, the orphans heard the shattering sounds of mirrors being smashed. Then, with angry stomps that came closer and closer, Switch began streaking down the hall. As she passed the dreg's doorway, they saw that she was wearing a giant silk scarf wrapped around her head like a massive beehive. Her shrieking continued down the stairs, and a few moments later came the slamming of the front door and the screeching of tires. The dregs sprang from their beds to the windows just in time to see a small convertible speed away from the house. And as the car took off down the dusty road, Switch's silk scarf came loose and flew off. Of course, you have probably guessed what it was hiding. Streaming from Switch's head, whipping through the air, was a headful of frizzled gray hair. "Oh," gasped Judy. chuckled Phoebe. "Ha!" snickered Vikram. Sarah Potley rubbed her eyes. Margret just smiled, watching the scarf flutter down to land in the dust. It is not, generally speaking, very nice to be pleased about someone else's misfortunes, but when that someone is a horrible and truly vain bully, it can be very hard to stop yourself. Part 3. The Dreams. Chapter 22. Fury Foiled. 9 times out of 10, saying better late than never makes very little sense. Most of the time, doing something too late is just as bad as never doing it at all. There is very little point, for example, in stepping on the brakes after you've driven your car off the edge of a cliff. It is also rather pointless to show up to your wedding 2 years after the date written on the invitations. And if you were delivering a pardon from the king for someone on their way to the gallows, arriving late would be just as bad as never coming at all. Some people, though, put a lot of stock into this phrase. Great Aunt Linda, for instance, had used it every Tuesday when her backgammon tournament ran late, and Margaret had to wait an extra 3 hours for supper. And Miss Switch, who preferred to punish dregs in a timely manner whenever possible, was saying it over and over to herself as she sat in a beauty parlor with her head slathered in a thick purple goop. When she finally reappeared in the doorway of the orphanage 7 hours later, her hair had been restored to a beautiful, silky blonde, and her face was as composed and flawless as ever. But her glittering eyes were seething with fury, and her mind was made up that when it came to punishments, they were most definitely better late than never. As Switch began her interrogations, however, it soon became clear that her fury had nowhere to go. Lacey explains that she had taken the boxes straight from the mailman and left the task of unpacking them to the doltish Emily Darlington. Little Emily, on persistent questioning, said it must have been the mirror who tampered with the boxes, or perhaps the music box ballerina. "Oh, yes, the ballerina!" gasped Emily, and she began to hum softly to herself and twirl around. Switch rolled her eyes, then turned her attention to the rest of the orphans, who were cowering around the room in terror. "So," she said softly, "that's it, is it? No one can tell me how this little mistake may have taken place?" No one spoke. Margaret, as you know, could easily have answered the Switch's question. But as she was conveniently forbidden to make any noise, she kept her mouth tightly shut. "Maybe the bottle?" Lacey said. "The mailman could have mixed up the delivery." Switch stared at Lacey carefully for several moments. Then she glared at the others, whipped around, and began descending the stairs. She was halfway up before she turned to face them again. "There will be no supper tonight," she said. "And unless I change my mind, no food in the morning no food in the morning either." Lacey had just flashed her wide, hyena-like smile at the dregs when Switch continued. "No supper for any of you." And turning again, she disappeared up the stairs. Lacey's hyena grin melted off her face in disbelief. In the whole history of Hopetoun Orphanage, only 3 pets had ever been punished by Miss Switch. The first was a sweet little lad called Milton Pinkrich, who had scribbled all over Switch's magazines thinking they were coloring books. When she saw what he had done, Switch scrawled pest across his face in a rage, and it didn't wash off for a month. The second was a delightfully handsome boy called Henry Fitzflattery, who had made the mistake of saying that Miss Switch must have been the most beautiful girl in all the world in her youth. Switch taped his hands over his eyes and left him that way for 3 days, causing him to stumble around, bumping into things. And on the third occasion, a precious little girl called Agnes Primrose had the misfortune of calling Matron Mother by accident. Switch made her walk around with a bar of soap in her mouth for a week. But this latest punishment was entirely unprecedented. Along with fashion, horoscopes, and egg whites, you see, Switch was a great believer in cause and effect. For every bit of punishing the Switch had ever ordered had been, in her mind, exactly fitting of the crime of the offending orphan. But starving the lot of them for something they hadn't done wasn't fitting in the slightest. It was, for all but one of them, an effect without a cause. So as the orphans stared up after their furious matron, pet and dreg alike wondered nervously what was going on in her head, because each of them knew what a rule-breaking Switch was a very dangerous Switch indeed. Chapter 23. Troubles Great and Troubles Small. When the orphans climbed into their beds that night, not a single one of them fell asleep easily. The pets tossed and turned with grumpiness, angry that their stomachs were growling just as much as the dregs. And the dregs tossed and turned in worry, anxious about the prospect of so many grumpy pets. And everyone tossed and turned, thinking about the furious and unpredictable Switch. Because she had to wait for all the tossing and turning to quiet down, Margret was later than usual slipping away into the yard. And as she approached the grassy lawn, she found that things were uneasy there too. Instead of the shouts and cheers of tiny, playful voices, the sounds that drifted towards her were the sounds of alarm. And the scene that met her eyes as she drew nearer was one she had never seen before. Oh no, not again! Moth down! A cluster of moths was flying across the lawn, carrying a leaf suspended by long silken threads. On the leaf was another twitching moth. It was Flitterwing. Flit! Cried Margret. What happened? She followed the moths through the tunnel and into the tree, where Flit's leaf was laid carefully down on an exposed root. A few fuzzy caterpillars came creeping down the tree bark, and from all over the tree, moths were hurrying from their nooks, where they all began talking at once. He's had a bad one of them said. I was winning, you know. Oh, be quiet, said Rimblewisp, coming to land at Flit's side. And don't crowd him. He paced along the leaf, looking down at his friend. Rimb, what happened? Said Margret. Is he very badly hurt? Humph, grumbled Rim. It's his own fault. Silly Twitterbug gobbled up a bad one before smelling it properly. But what's he's gobbled? Cried Margret. A nimbler, said Pip with a sigh, crawling onto Margaret's knee. The good ones have dried up again. They've all gone sour. The feelers of every moth drooped sadly as the moths fell into whispering, and Margret leaned against the great, wrinkled trunk, her mind whirring. Chances are, you've already guessed what Margret was thinking, because you're guessing it too. After Switch had been made ridiculous on the roof, and the children had slept happily in their beds after so many unhappy nights, the nibblers had been sweet and good. And now, with the Switch more terrifying than ever, the dreams of the orphans had all turned to nightmares. When the tree began to hum and talk again, Margret looked up to see that Flit had stopped twitching and was sleeping peacefully. The mood of the tree had shifted as though a storm cloud had passed overhead, and the moths were soon laughing and fluttering as though nothing had happened. They must, Margret realized, have done this many times before. Whirlawomps? Someone cried a few minutes later. Just the thing! Game's afoot! One by one, the moths flew off, hurrying out to the grassy lawn to begin a new game. You see, there are many different ways of dealing with trouble, as there are people in the world. Some people choose to bury their heads deep in the sand. Others prefer to plug their ears and sing loudly until the hardship is past. But moths are different. Rather than run from trouble or sit in a corner and mope, moths will throw themselves into their games. Moths prefer to believe that no matter the trouble, every bad thing will come right in the end. And in the meantime, you ought to try to have a good time. Come on, Margret, said Pip. Margret smiled, then shaking her worries from her head the best she could, she rose to join them. Chapter 24. A very important visit. Miss Switch, when faced with life's troubles, would always react in the same way. She would hold a grudge. In fact, grudge holding was one of her greatest talents. Ever since the disaster of the hair tonic, she had decided to hold one against the entire world. An anxious silence had fallen over the orphanage, broken only by the sound of the matron's moody footfalls coming around a corner, and of orphans scampering out of sight like skittish rabbits. There was no sign of anything that would disrupt her nasty mood until 2 days later, when the telephone rang. Good morning, Hopeton Orphanage. This is the matron speaking, said Miss Switch in her syrupy telephone answering voice. Good morning, it's Hannah calling, said the soft voice of Hannah Tender. Hannah, how nice, said Miss Switch. Does this mean I'm to expect a new arrival at the orphanage? No, I'm calling because I have some rather exciting news, said Hannah. Oh, said the Switch, examining her nail polish. I'd love to come by and tell you in person. Of course, it's always a pleasure. Wonderful, I'll see you soon, said Hannah, and she hung up. Rolling her eyes, Switch went and found her thin, golden whistle. We're reading Margret and the Moth Tree. It's a book that I grew up with that I think deserves a lot more recognition than it gets. Because it's largely made me into the person I am today. But, rolling her eyes, Miss Switch went and found her thin, golden whistle. She gave it a half-hearted blow, then yawned. Hannah always did such tiresome things, like talking about philanthropy and hugging the orphans. Half an hour later, when Hannah pulled up to the house in the CLC's pink car, Miss Switch ushered her onto the porch where an elaborate tea had been laid out. "How lovely! You really didn't have to, just for me," said Hannah. "No trouble," said Switch, slouching into her chair. People often say "no trouble" to be polite, but in this case, it really had been no trouble. 5 dregs had run themselves ragged preparing tea, while Switch took her time selecting the day's outfit. She had settled upon one of her plainer aprons and accessorized it with a dusting of soot across her arms. "I've just been cleaning the fireplaces," she told Hannah. "The darling orphans are playing in the garden." This was true, as the orphans had been indeed ordered to play duck, duck, goose by the rose bushes. But whenever the pets chose a dreg to be goose, they would whack them on the head as hard as they could, giving the dreg a nasty headache. Margret had already been picked, so she sat there, holding her throbbing head. She concentrated on eavesdropping. "Wouldn't the children like some of this?" Hannah was saying. "They've already eaten." "Chocolate pancakes with bacon," Switch said, "and fruit," she added. "Oh, I see," said Hannah, with just a hint of a frown. "Well, I won't keep you in suspense any longer. I'm happy to be the one to tell you, on behalf of the Concerned Ladies Club, that you have been chosen to receive an award of service. You're the Caregiver of the Year." At these words, Switch looked up at Hannah in surprise. "What does that mean?" she said. "Well, in a few days you'll be given a special medal, and there'll be speeches. All the members of the CLC will be here, and the mayor too." "Oh, Hannah," said Switch, sitting up straight and beaming. She seemed suddenly much younger. "Goodness me, how very, very kind. How unexpected. Do you think there'd be a photographer?" Miss Switch had a few different smiles. She put them on for different times as it suited her, just like her collection of tattered aprons. There was her motherly smile, which she used in front of the Concerned Ladies Club and on adoption days. There was her carnivorous smile, which she used to terrorize dregs before bringing them to tears. And then there was her dazzling smile, which she used to stupefy clueless members of the public. But this one, rarely seen, was a genuine one. And a genuine smile, especially on someone so beautiful, is hard not to return. "That's a marvelous idea," said Hannah, smiling back. A less kind person than Hannah might have felt jealous that she wasn't the one being rewarded for her hard work, but Hannah was the sort of person who felt glad for other people's good fortune. This unselfishness, in Switch's view, was one of her more irritating qualities. "Goose!" came Lacey's violent scream from the garden, followed by a loud cry of pain. "Well, I'd better let you get back to the children," cried Hannah, finishing her tea. "Yes, they can get a tad boisterous, dear things." Hannah and Switch said their goodbyes, and Hannah, her head full of ideas for Switch's big day, headed back to the pink car. But when Hannah looked back over her shoulder to wave, she saw that the Switch hadn't moved. The matron was still standing on the porch, staring in front of her with a strange look in her eyes. The youthful look of happiness had lit up her face a moment before it was gone. She now wore a look that was fierce and triumphant. It only lasted a second or two before Switch glided down the porch steps and towards the garden, and as Hannah drove away down the dusty road, she thought she must have imagined it. Gotta fix myself again. Chapter 25. 2 Orphans. A long time before our story takes place, another little girl lived in the very same orphanage where our Margret found herself a prisoner. Just like Margret, she was not a child praised for her looks, but she had a sweet little heart. Her name was Hannah Tender. The orphanage was a very different place in Hannah's time. The biggest difference was that there was no tyrannical matron tormenting children at every waking hour. Instead, the elderly and well-educated Professor Thrumble ran things. Switch, as you may have noticed, didn't teach the orphans much of anything. The master, however, taught that textbooks, appendices? Oh, fuck, I can't read. And dictionaries were the most important things in life. He had been quite an old man when the orphanage was built, and by the time Hannah arrived, his bushy eyebrows had turned bright white, and his voice was even more gravelly than before. The unfortunate thing was, the older the master became, the longer and more random his lessons were. "You there," he would say to Hannah. "Shannon, isn't it? Come along, it's time for a lesson." Every day he would gather Hannah and the other orphans together, and every day they would have to sit through dreadfully dull lectures about things like the history of cabbage. He would go on for hours, sometimes long into the night, until the children laid their heads on their desks and fell asleep from boredom. But aside from Professor Thumble's never-ending lessons, the children of the orphanage were left mostly to themselves. As Hannah grew older, she began to notice that the pretty little girls and the handsome young boys were adopted and taken away from the orphanage, while she, for some reason, was always overlooked. "It is clear to me, based on my education, that if you were better looking, you'd have parents by now," the master said absently one day. "Why don't you try looking better?" So Hannah tried to stand up straighter and comb her hair and smile as much as she possibly could. Yet still no one chose her, and just like Margaret, Hannah tried to make the best of her situation. Hannah's best friend was another overlooked girl called Angelica. Angelica had stringy, mud-colored hair, spotty skin, and crooked front teeth that were far too big for her mouth. And while beauty may be in the eye of the beholder, there wasn't a single parent who could behold her for more than a few moments before moving their gaze to a more attractive child. But neither Hannah nor Angelica cared what the other looked like. Together, they found little ways to make life in the orphanage more bearable, like passing silly notes to each other during Professor Thumble's lessons, and playing make-believe for hours on end. Their favorite game was imagining what it would be like to be adopted by loving parents and taken to wonderful homes. "Maybe I could be adopted by a king," Angelica would say, "and I would become a princess. Maybe I would have a baby brother or sister who could be my friend," Hannah would say, "and I'd never have to be lonely again. Maybe I'll grow up to be beautiful," Angelica would say, "and everyone will love me." There are many dreams that don't mean a thing. Dreams about taking a ferry to the Arctic to meet the Prime Minister, or being chased around in your kindergarten classroom by an angry dentist, for instance, probably mean very little. I shall hydrate. I thought you fell asleep, Bunny. Not gonna lie. Fair. I think I put Waze to sleep last night. At some point, they just stopped responding. But the kind of dream you keep deep inside your heart to remind yourself of what you hope and wish for. The kind of dream you whisper into your pillow every night before you fall asleep. That kind of dream can feed a moth full of trees, and a moth full of trees, a tree full of moths, and can mean a great deal. As often happens with children, Hannah and Angelica grew up. Hannah didn't change very much on the outside. What she did do was make several more good friends among the other orphans, and discover that she had a large supply of kindness in her heart. When new children arrived at the orphanage, Hannah liked nothing more than to make them feel welcome. She would walk with them to the master's lectures, or sit with them at mealtimes, or smile at them when she passed them in the hall. Unlike Hannah, Angelica changed a lot on the outside. For one thing, her mouth grew to make room for her teeth, which no longer looked quite so large or crooked. And when Angelica discovered that the other orphans had stopped picking on her as a result, it gave her a wonderful feeling. So while Hannah was off making new friends, Angelica was busy going through each of her features and thinking of ways she could improve them. And when Hannah and Angelica were old enough to set out on their own, Hannah moved into the very town where you first saw her, and found a job in philanthropy. This allowed her to keep helping children as lonesome as she had once been, which filled her life with happiness. But Angelica moved into a big city where she got a job at a dressmaker's shop. As soon as she had saved up enough money, she bought herself a mouthful of braces to straighten out her teeth, and expensive skin cream to smooth out her complexion, and every other product she thought could help her appearance. When she had saved up some more money, she went to a beauty parlor and had her colored hair dyed blonde. And then she began to notice people stopping in their tracks just to stare at her, and she knew that the thing she had dreamed of every night of her life had come true. She had grown up beautiful. Have you put the pieces together? Can you guess what happened to the orphan called Angelica one day as she was on her way to work? Excusez-moi, said a glorious woman, rushing up to her on the street. What is your name, darling? Said a man with a ponytail, who was with her. It's Angelica, said Angelica. Angelica Switch. You see, no one pops into the world filled with fury and hate like a rotten, wormy apple. Just as every story has a villain, every villain has a story. Sometimes the rottenness seeps in slowly over many lonesome years, but other times, through the words of a cruel photographer and the sudden loss of a dream, it rushes in all at once, like water through a broken dam. These were the memories that were flitting around in Miss Switch's mind as she watched Hannah's car drive off down the dusty road. But instead of paying them any attention, she brushed them away as if they were nothing more than bothersome cobwebs, and didn't think of them again. Chapter 26. The Derangement of Toby Bobbins. When something happens that is the exact opposite of what you would expect would happen, that is called irony. The Titanic being nicknamed unsinkable was ironic, because the last thing you'd expect an unsinkable ship to do is spring a leak on her first voyage at sea. Chopping off your hair and selling it to a wig maker to buy your best friend a new baseball is ironic if your friend just sold her bat to buy you a new hairbrush. Miss Switch being given an award for Caregiver of the Year was ironic because, as you know, Miss Switch was unfit to care for a tomato plant, much less a child. But Miss Switch was untroubled by irony. Even when she was given the award for kindness, she had no problem acting as unkindly as possible. So, for the very next morning, when Lacey bundled up the stairs, yelling that Toby Bobbins had ruined the matron's best silk dress in the laundry tubs, Switch emerged from her room, feeling just as unkind as ever. Working the tubs was one of the worst jobs a dreg could get. There were 10 massive tubs deep in the bowels of the orphanage, each with a wooden stepladder that wobbled when you went up it. On tub duty, the first thing you had to do was pour soap and bleach and chemicals into scalding water, and try not to burn yourself when you loaded in the dirty clothes. Once this was done, you had to stand for hours in the steamy, smelly basement, stirring tubs with a long wooden paddle to make sure everything was evenly washed. Toby, who had been working the tubs for a good 4 hours that morning, had become so tired and dizzy from the smell of bleach that he'd fallen asleep at his post and forgotten to stir the delicate clothes. When Switch stepped into the laundry room and saw her expensive dress reduced to a dripping pile of tatters, she was secretly delighted. This may seem like a very odd reaction, as Switch dearly loved owning pretty and expensive things. But the more important truth about Switch is this: she loved cruelty more. Hello, Cam! How are you? I hope you're doing well. Welcome to some cozy vibes. Switch was an artist when it came to punishment, and as her glittering eyes took in the sight of chubby Toby Bobbins and the ruined silk dress, she knew that he was just the inspiration she needed. So, she said sweetly to red-faced Toby, you've had yourself a nice little nap, I hear. You're probably feeling very refreshed. Toby gave a very small nod. I don't see that you'll be needing to sleep anymore, will you? Switch said. Not right now, Miss Switch, said Toby meekly. Not ever, smiled the Switch. And from that moment on, Toby was forbidden to sleep. Very fair, very fair. Yeah, I figure we're on a streak of trying some new things, so last night I started this book, knowing it would only take around maybe 2. It's a book that only takes about 4 hours to read slowly, but would take me an hour if I was reading it on my own, because I'm a speed reader. Switch shut him up in a cupboard in the basement, and the pets were set on a nightly schedule to take turns keeping him awake by poking at him with a long stick whenever he closes his eyes. This went on for 2 nights in a row, and on the morning of the 3rd day, the day of Switch's award ceremony, when Margret and Judy brought Toby his breakfast mush, they found him sitting on the floor with an aluminum pot on his head, singing quietly, "What do you do with the drunken sick?" Just as the sun was rising, warbled Toby. He stared at Judy, cross-eyed. "Captain!" "Oh no!" Judy gasped in horror. "He's gone off the edge." "Hey, Nonny," sang Toby. "Nifty Nonny Puffs." And then, without even taking a bite of his breakfast, he closed his eyes, fell flat on the floor, and started snoring. No amount of poking and kicking and pinching from the pets could wake him up again. News of the breakdown reached Switch, who interrupted her beauty preparations to pay a special visit to Toby's cupboard. When she saw how successful her punishment had been, she was absolutely delighted. I shall. And a good stretch. We're almost done the book. We got, like, what is it, 5 more chapters? Laughing as if the whole thing were a marvelous joke, she waved a hand at Margret and Judy to have them carry Toby up to his bed. That laugh of Switch's and that casual wave of her hand were so unfeeling that Margret couldn't stand it. She had never been so angry in her entire life. Anger was one of the great many things that Great Aunt Linda hadn't approved of, along with idle hands and poor table manners. But anger is a perfectly natural emotion, and sometimes it can tell you very important things. As Margret carried Toby up the stairs, she saw the pitiful way his tongue rolled out of his open mouth. She heard the distant peals of Switch's laughter, and her anger told her she had to do something. As every other drag trudged down to the basement to begin a massive laundry scrubbing for Switch's big day, Margret slipped away, and when she was sure no one was looking, she ran out into the bright afternoon, heading for the moth tree. Chapter 27. The Waking of the Moths. If you have ever lived in any significant amount of time in this world, you will have noticed that different things come naturally to different types of creatures. It is in the nature of a spotted woodpecker, for example, to munch on grubs and worms and to enjoy it immensely, just as it is the nature of grubs and worms to be munched on by spotted woodpeckers and to not enjoy the experience quite so much. It is in the nature of small infants to cry and make a ruckus whenever they are hungry or moist, just as it is the nature of airplane passengers to cry and make a ruckus whenever they are seated next to small infants. These are simply the rules of nature. There are also some things that do not come naturally. It is not in the nature of small girls, for example, to hear the tiniest and quietest of noises. And it is not in the nature of moths to awaken in the broad daylight and tinker in the affairs of humans. But there are always exceptions to the rules. When Margret came scrambling through the thorny tunnel, the moths of the tree were fast asleep, and try as she might, she couldn't rouse them. "Flit!" she cried as she caught sight of the sleeping moth. "Rumblewisp! Everyone, wake up!" But not a single moth stirred. Finally, she caught sight of Pip's familiar gray wings. "Pip!" she cried, shaking the branch where he slept. "Wake up! Oh, wake up!" Pip twitched and mumbled. "Pipperflit!" Mark shouted. "Margret!" Pip muttered, looking blearily up at her. "You're early. Why don't you come back later?" And he laid his head back down on the branch. "Pip, don't go back to sleep," Margret said quickly. "Listen to me. I know what's been happening to the Nibblers. It's Switch." "The Switch," muttered Pip. "Yes, she's been turning them sour by tormenting us dregs." "Wait," said Pip with a shake of his head. Did you say Nibblers? Yes, said Margret. We need to get rid of Miss Switch, and then all the Nibblers will go right back to the way they used to be. Remember, Pip? Licorice and berries and honey? But I need your help. You and all the moths. Help me wake them up. You can count on me, Margret, Pip said with a yawn, nodding his head. Down with the dung waddler. But then he turned around to the sleeping moths, flicking his wings uncertainly. Only, moths don't wake up in the daytime. Pip, said Margret, an idea forming in her head. Look at it like a game. The greatest game you've ever played. A game to bring back the good Nibblers. At this, Pip perked up. His wings began to twitch. Then he flew up into the air. Game's afoot! He cried. All moths up for the greatest game! The tree began to stir and the moths began to grumble. What's going on? Go back to sleep, Pip. We'll play tonight. The greatest game of all! Pip cried. It's happening now! And the prize is a whopping great load of Nibblers, the most tastiest Nibblers you could possibly chase down. Enough for everyone! Now the tree began to rustle as the moths began muttering all at once. What's he saying? Nibblers? The greatest game! Everyone, Margret called over the noise, staring up at the crowd of tiny faces. This will be a game you'll never forget for the rest of your lives, and you only get to play it once. If you win, it will be just as Pip said. The hum of the tree grew into a quiet roar. Then, high up in the branches, a single voice cried, For Nibblers! All right, what's it? Cried Flit. Now listen carefully, Margret said. Here's what we're going to do. So, Nibblers are dreams, just so you know, Cam. Due to Switch's tormenting of the dregs, the Nibblers have been bad because everyone's having nightmares and haven't been sleeping restfully. But there were a few nights where Margret got a little bit of revenge and everyone was just a little bit happier, so their dreams were good, so the Nibblers were just as good. And the moths really like Nibblers. They're very tasty. Chapter 28. The Rallying of the Dregs. In preparation for the awards ceremony, Miss Switch had tripled her usual beauty regime. She had powdered and primed, she had creamed and curled, she had tucked and trimmed. She had spent hours picking an outfit that was the perfect combination of modesty and grace, and her final selection was now lying neatly on her bed. As the hour of her triumph drew near, she sat at her vanity table, wearing a wrinkle-reducing face cream and practicing her acceptance speech in her head. But as Switch was smiling smugly at her reflection, a very different kind of preparation was underway outdoors. Just outside the orphanage, crouched quietly next to the side door, Margret was waiting. When a small gray moth came flying towards her a moment later, she rose. The dregs are in the underground, said Pip, coming to land on her shoulder. The basement, you mean? Said Margret. That's the one. That wonky-nosed pet is guarding them. And the others? Margret asked. Sneaking snacks, said Pip. Margret nodded. Switch had ordered the dregs to rewash every piece of clothing and linen in the house so that everything would be extra clean for the photographer. And since none of the pets wants the job of keeping an eye on them in the steamy room, guard duty had fallen onto the dreggish pet, Agatha Spink. I think I know what to do, said Margret. Treading softly, she crept through the door into the orphanage. Pip flew ahead to check on the pets, who were now at the long carved table in the dining room. All clear, he called. Margret darted into the kitchen and, rummaging around in the pantry, quickly gathered up 2 large handfuls of cookies. Then, before the pets even knew she had been there, she was gone. Keeping out of sight, she made her way to the basement stairs. When she reached the bottom, she found a pouting, fidgety Agatha Spink, leaning unhappily against the doorway of the laundry room. Unfortunately, things had not much improved for Agatha since her efforts to win over Miss Switch. She still spent most of her days wishing she fitted in. She still spent most of her nights afraid of being tossed out into the cold. Though, to it all, she had grown to be the most miserable of all the orphans. Hey! She shouted when she saw Margret approaching. You're supposed to be in there, with the others! Then, realizing it was Margret she was talking to, She clapped a hand over her mouth in horror. Miss Switch sent these down for you, Margret said immediately, holding up the cookies with a smile. She wants you to know that she really appreciates all the hard work you're doing, even though she sometimes doesn't show it. Anyway, I have to get back to work now. Without giving Agatha a moment to object, Margret pressed the cookies into her hand, strode purposefully into the laundry room, and shut the door behind her. Though her heart was racing, she knew that Agatha, standing wide-eyed and open-mouthed in the hallway, had believed her, if only because she so deeply wanted to. But Margret didn't have time to feel glad or proud or relieved just yet. Her real challenge was still yet to come. All around her, the dregs of the orphanage were stirring steaming pots of laundry. Their faces were red with heat, their clothes stained with sweat, and their arms and legs had broken out in splotches where boiling water had splashed up and burned them. Gathering her courage, Margret took 2 steps into the room. Starting a revolution is a tricky thing. Usually kings or emperors or elementary school teachers who go around stomping on their subjects do a good job of that, and the subjects never think of standing up to them. A very good speech is sometimes needed to get things going, and a very good speech is what Margret had to make now, as she stood with Pip on her shoulder looking down at the downtrodden dregs. "Go on, Margret," said Pip. Margret cleared her throat. "Everyone, I have something to say." The dregs closest to her looked up in shock, then turned back to their work quickly. Margret glanced at Pip, who flicked his wings encouragingly. She took a deep breath, walked to an overturned bucket in the center of the room, and stood on top of it. "Dregs!" she said as loudly as she could. A few more dregs looked up, and most of them pretended as if they hadn't heard her. "Listen to me!" cried Margret. "For too long we've suffered under the rule of the switch." The splashes of paddles quieted as several dregs stopped their stirring. "We've scrubbed and cleaned and cooked, and what has it brought us?" "Nothing," said quiet Timothy Smealing, and a few more dregs turned to listen. "Nothing," agreed Margret. "Nothing but pinches and punishments. Nothing but taunts and torments, and it's worse than it's ever been." Now the whole room was watching her, and several dregs were nodding. "Think of Sarah Potley. Think of Toby. Think of everything she's done to each of you," Margret cried. "The time has come to act. We can't let Switch push us around for one more second." "That's right," said Phoebe Frizzleton. "It's not fair." "She needs to be stopped," said Bessie Blotchley. Margret nodded firmly. "We've got to show the world Switch's true colors." "But how can we?" said Judy, her eyes wide. "No one's ever managed it before." "I'm talking about joining forces," said Margret. "The Switch is getting an award today. A lot of people will be visiting the orphanage. We're going to make sure that they see her the way we see her, and that she can't talk her way out of it. Everyone will need to help if it's going to work. So, are we in this together?" For a moment, no one spoke. "We're with you, Margret!" Vikram suddenly cried, his eyes shining. "Yeah!" cried the rest of the dregs. "Tell us what you need us to do," piped Timothy Smealing. "Right," said Margret. "Bessie Blotchley, I need you to go up to the roof and sit by the chimney. When you get the signal, I want you to start knocking on it. Phoebe Frizzleton, you and Vikram will have to take care of Agatha Spink. Make sure she doesn't raise alarm. Helen and Timothy, in exactly 10 minutes, gather the rest of the dregs and sit in the front hall for when the grown-ups come. No more games or smiles this time." "Got it," said Bessie Blotchley. "Aye, aye," said Phoebe Frizzleton. "We're with you, Margret," said Helen Ravish. "And Judy," Margret said, "you're with me. We're going to take care of the pets." Judy looked nervous, but nodded bravely. "Okay, everyone," Margret said. "Let's go." And as if she had just blown the Switch's golden whistle, the dregs burst through the basement door. "But Margret," Judy said, as the pair of them passed the hollering Agatha Spink being pushed into the broom cupboard, "there's no way the 2 of us are a match for all the pets." "It's not just the 2 of us," Margret said. "Just wait and see." Chapter 29. Pets Petrified. If Margret had mentioned that her great plan rested on nothing more than a tree full of small gray moths, Judy might have been less willing to just wait and see. But Margret didn't mention it, because Judy didn't yet know one very important fact: that small creatures are sometimes capable of great things. "Wait here," Margret said. "As soon as you see me coming around the corner, call for Lacey as loud as you can." Judy nodded. Margaret slipped down the hall and around the corner to an open window. "All right, Pip," said Margaret. "It's time. Send up the signal." "Right!" cried Pip, flicking his wings with excitement. Flying out the window, he zipped around around in 3 big loop-de-loops. Margaret held her breath and stared out into the yard. Sure enough, after only a moment, she saw the slightest movement of another tiny moth rising up from the vegetable garden. The moth returned Pip's loop-de-loop signal, then came zooming towards the window. "Here they come!" cried Pip, landing on the sill near Margaret. The new moth came zipping through the window and was followed by another, then another, and 100 more. Soon the air was filled with an enormous stream of moths, flying right through the window and coming to land at Margaret's feet. She could hear their tiny laughing voices saying, "Right, Think Ripple," and "The greatest game," and "Whizwinger, watch my foot." "All right, moths," Margaret whispered. "Form up." "Right," said the moths. With a flurry of wings, a group of about 20 moths fluttered into a flat circular formation about the size of a dinner plate and landed on the floor. Once they'd done that, the second group gathered to flutter right above them, making another plate-sized layer. Groups of moths continued to pile one on top of another, fluttering above the moths below them until the column of moths was a head taller than Margaret herself. The sight was astonishing to behold. A tower of moths fluttered and wriggled and swayed like some strange sea creature. "Perfect," said Margaret. "Is everyone ready?" "Ready," called the moths. Margaret ran back around the corner and waved at Judy. "Lacey!" Judy began yelling. "Come quick, Lacey!" Margaret only had time to whisper, "Don't worry, they're on our side," to Judy before the monstrous moth creature appeared around the corner, swaying and floating slowly towards them. "Yikes!" screamed Judy in real fear. "Lacey! Pets! Hurry!" A moment later, Lacey herself appeared. "What is it, Dreg?" she shouted at Judy, looking more than ready to pummel her. But then her eye caught sight of the massive beast at the end of the hall. Just as it is rather satisfying to see nasty tyrants get a taste of their own medicine, it is extremely pleasant to see someone who has spent their whole life scaring people have her own wits scared silly. Lacey shrieked, jumped into the air, and began running in circles and screaming. The sound of Lacey's screaming in fear was something that had never been heard before within the walls of Hopeton Orphanage, and the noise drew the rest of the pets to the hallway in an instant. When they saw the swaying moth tower, they followed Lacey's example and began to scream too. "What is that?" they shrieked. "Goodness!" said Margaret loudly. "It's a carnivorous flapdragon. I've read about them. They're so deadly that one bite will kill you in a heartbeat." This news made Lacey even more hysterical, and as she ran in circles, she started screaming, "What do we do? What do we do?" "The flapdragon can't open doors," Margaret cried. "Quick, the bedroom! You'll be safe in there." Margaret didn't need to say another word. The pets stampeded into their bedroom like a herd of antelopes fleeing from a hungry lion. "Do you want me to shut the door?" Margaret asked them. "Yes," cried the pets. Shut it quickly." "Shall I lock it too, just to be safe?" "Yes," screamed the pets. "For goodness sake, lock it." "Okay," said Margaret, slamming the door shut with a satisfying bang. She lowered the hatch, and the pets were trapped. Margaret smiled and nodded to the moths, who fell away from their tower and fluttered all around her in a great cheering crowd. "Thanks, everyone," she whispered. "We did it!" "Any time, Margaret," said the chorus of voices. "On to the next." And in a jumble of loop-de-loops, they headed back out the open window. "It worked," laughed Pip, landing on Margaret's shoulder. "Moths!" breathed Judy. "That was amazing! I never knew moths could do things like that." "Yes," said Margaret. "Moths can do all sorts of things." But she didn't tell Judy anything more right then, for there was still work to be done. With pounding hearts, the 2 orphans and the moth headed straight to the bedroom of the Switch. Chapter 30. The Greatest Game. For anyone who didn't know better, the simple wooden door to Switch's private sitting room might not have looked like anything much. Most people wouldn't have noticed the rich polish of the wood or the shine of the silver doorknob, or paused to smell the expensive perfumes wafting from inside. Most people would never have suspected that the door hid anything very remarkable. But as Margaret, Pip, and Judy headed to the end of the Switch's corridor, they noticed all of these things, and they knew what was waiting for them behind the door must be very remarkable indeed. "All right, Pip," Margret said. "This is it." Judy stared open-mouthed as, on cue, Pip flew from Margaret's shoulder and crept under the door. "All clear," he called from inside. Margaret nodded at Judy and slowly turned the silver knob. The door opened with the tiniest of squeaks, and Margaret and Judy slipped inside. A dazzling sight met their eyes. Switch's sitting room had 3 layers of Turkish rugs, tapestries on the walls, and dozens of vases, statues, and candelabras. Margaret recognized some of them as from her very first day in the orphanage, and that they had decorated the ground floor. Just like a magpie hoarding shiny objects in its nest, Switch had greedily gathered all the treasures in the house for her own enjoyment. Moving farther into the room, Margaret and Judy came to another door, this one painted bright gold, and with a crystal knob. It was a door lavish enough for a queen. It was the door to Switch's bedroom. Margaret put her eye to the keyhole and squinted. The room was filled with clothes, shoes, hats, handheld bags, and jewelry. Gold and silver, diamonds and pearls. Switch had stuffed the high-ceilinged room so full that it looked like a den of a fashionable dragon. Stacks of glossy magazines were crammed wherever they could fit, and on every wall was a mirror, which made the hoard seem even bigger. "I can hear her unscrewing a jar," Margaret whispered. "It's such an important day," Judy whispered back. "I bet she wants to look extra beautiful." "Pip, can you get a closer look?" "Of course," said Pip. He crept through the crack under the door. "Yep," he said. "She's putting stuff on her face. Looks like she's almost finished." "It's time," Margaret said to Judy, who hadn't heard any of that. "Judy, go to the roof and give Phoebe the signal." Judy nodded and darted from the room. "Okay, Pip," Margaret whispered. "Send the alert." What happened next inside the room could have made the most serious person you know burst out laughing. Miss Switch was sitting at her vanity table wearing a girlish blue dress that puffed out at her knees in a very charming way. She was just putting on a delicate pink blush on the apples of her cheeks when a strange knocking sound drifted down the chimney at the other side of the room. When the knocking continued, she frowned, walking over to the fireplace and stuck her head in to investigate. As she peered up the chimney, the knocking was joined by other sounds. A scraping noise. A soft sort of fluttering. Bewildered, she stuck her head farther in. Before she even knew what was happening, before she could even think about pulling herself back, a gigantic puff of black soot came shooting down from up above. "Ugh!" cried the matron, covering her eyes with her hands and hacking. The soot plastered across her face, it was buried in her golden hair, and it was stuck in her teeth and in her eyelashes and up her nose, and smudged all across the front of her dress. She broke into a sneezing fit, staggering backwards, but this indignity was only the beginning. "Game's afoot!" came the mothish voice that Margaret could hear, and the Switch could not. Zooming down the chimney and out of the fireplace came a moth covered in dark soot. "Get away!" Switch shrieked as it flew straight towards her, starting to flap around her head. But the moth did not get away. And to Switch's horror, 100 more sooty moths come flying from the chimney, encircling her in a cloud of fluttering gray wings. Dipping their feet into an open pot of cream, one by one the moths swooped down to land on her, leaving their gooey footprints across her face and arms. Flailing her arms in a panic, Switch began to shriek and run from one side of the room to the other. Through it all, Margaret watched at the keyhole. "She's on the run," said Pip, squeezing under the door. "That's your cue." Margaret began knocking loudly on the matron's door. "Miss Switch," she called, "is everything all right? I heard a scream." The bedroom door swung open, and it took every ounce of Margaret's self-control not to burst out laughing. The matron stood in the doorway, covered from head to toe with dust and soot and goo. Her hair was sticking out wildly, her eyes bulging with fear. "Bugs!" cried the Switch frantically. "My room is infested!" Then, seeing who was standing in front of her, she tried to compose herself. "Dreg, get in there right now and fix it!" "Thank you for the head pats, Bunny!" Margaret dashed into the room, and the moths circled around her, cheering. "I tagged its nose," said one. "I got it on the bum," said another. "I think we're winning," said another. 10 points! cried another, who sounded like Flip. Margret smiled at the circling moths and gave a quick nod towards Switch's open window. At her signal, a second wave of moths came swooping in through the window. Unlike the others, they were free from soot, but each was carrying a long string with a single caterpillar hanging from the bottom. "Hi, Margret!" called the caterpillars. A moment later, the moths had landed on Switch's jewelry case, and the caterpillars set work fastening their threads to her ropes of pearls and diamonds. When the moths took flight again, the jewels took flight with them, hanging from the bottoms of silken threads. For a while, a single moth is just strong enough to carry one small blue purple. Hundreds of moths can carry much more. "Oh no!" Margret called out. "Miss Switch, your jewels!" When Switch turned back to look, what she saw made her blood run cold. The vile bugs were flying off towards the window, carrying her glittering necklaces. "Thieves!" bellowed the Switch. "I'm being robbed!" "Quick!" Margret cried. "We'll have to catch them!" With a nod at the moths, she began grabbing jewels from the air. Switch hesitated, then darted back across the room, and the triumphant tears of the moths spurred her on. Margret began draping layers of necklaces around the matron's long neck. "Faster, dreg!" Switch screeched, as Margret hurried around the empty jewel case. "That's everything," she said. Without so much as a glance in Margaret's direction, the soot-covered Switch ran from the room, leaving Margret to hurry along behind her. Through the orphanage they went, through the ornate sitting room, past the bedrooms of the orphans, and down the front stairs. But when they reached the bottom, Switch froze. The dregs were waiting for her in the front hall. There was a shocked silence for several moments as the dregs stared at the grimy, goggled-eyed matron. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, came a tiny giggle. The giggle spread and grew, and soon the entire room was giggling, then laughing, then roaring at the sooty sight before them. "Quiet!" hissed the Switch in her threatening low voice, but the roar of the dregs kept getting louder. "Stop laughing right now! Stop it or I'll feed you all to the hobos!" she shouted, but her threats were drowned out by the glee of children. Several of them had fallen to the ground with laughter and were kicking their feet in the air. Rage filled Switch's heart, and she stared around at the orphans in fury. Her gaze fell upon Julie giggling loudly near the front of the group. "I said quiet!" Switch screamed hysterically, and grabbed Judy by the arm and lifted her high in the air. "Don't!" cried Margret, grabbing hold of Switch's other arm to stop her. But Switch threw Margret off wildly and began to shake poor Judy. "How dare you laugh at me? You're worthless! You're pointless! You're nothing but a dreg!" Just as she raised a hand to strike the dangling girl, a different sound cut through all the laughter and screaming and chaos. "Miss Switch!" The loud voice was booming, and the children all turned towards it. They saw the front door, the commanding presence of the sheriff. And standing just behind him, staring at the dreadful scene, were Gertrude, Prudy, and Hannah, and a dozen of townspeople and 3 newspaper reporters with flashbulb cameras. Chapter 31. The Unmasking. Do you know the feeling you get right before a china plate smashes to the ground? Unless you are in a Greek restaurant, this is a very tense sort of feeling to have. It is just this feeling that hung in the air for a split second before the cameras began madly flashing into soot-covered, orphan-shaking, bejeweled Miss Switch. At first, Switch didn't seem able to move. She stood frozen in her bizarre pose and stared back at the shocked people in the doorway. But then she dropped Judy and turned to the sheriff. "Sheriff, I can explain!" she gasped. This time, it was Margret who wouldn't let her finish. "She's a thief!" Margret cried. The Hope Dinners gasped, and Margret took a step forward. "She's stolen all of your money to buy those jewels, and she treats us like slaves!" "It's true," cried the other orphans. "She starves us. She tortures us. She calls us dregs." Every orphan in the hall was nodding and holding up bruised, pinched arms. "No!" Switch cried desperately. "The dear children are only joking with you. We were playing a game, you see, and I was playing the Wicked Witch." But the sheriff's face had darkened. "There's nothing worse than a thief," he said, shaking his head. "But you, Miss Switch, are a thief and a liar." The white-haired male picklewort emerged from the crowd clutching a golden trophy. "We can't give an award to a thieving liar." "I should think not, Harold," said Gertrude. "It would be the absolute opposite of procedure." "How could someone so beautiful do something so dreadful?" said Prudy, looking horrified. "Margret," said Hannah, running to pull Margret into a hug. "I'm so sorry I didn't believe you." In another moment, the rest of the crowd had rushed into the house to hug and comfort the other orphans. "Poor little ragamuffins," they cried. "Such sweet little things." Some of the townspeople found they didn't want to stop hugging the orphans, so they adopted them on the spot. One couple instantly fell in love with poor, brave Judy and asked her if she wanted them for parents, which she did. Sarah Potley went home with a lonely lady whose children were all grown up and living far away. And bleary-eyed Toby Bobkins, who had finally woken from his long sleep, came stumbling down the stairs, captured the heart of a plump, grandmotherly woman. She asked him to be her new son, and he agreed, so long as laundry wasn't one of his chores. The remaining townspeople turned their attention to Miss Switch. "Despicable," muttered one well-dressed lady in a fancy hat. "To think all of our generous donations went straight into her greedy hands." "It's unthinkable," said old Mayor Picklewort. "After all our good philanthropy. Don't anyone tell the Munsfielders about this." The concerned ladies' club were the most horrified of all. "This calls for an emergency meeting," said Prudy. "It's not in the schedule," Gertrude said, checking her day planner, "but I suppose we can make an exception. Our first order of business is to decide what to do with the caregiver of the Year Award. It would seem very ironic to give it to Miss Switch under the circumstances." "Shouldn't we decide what to do with the orphans first?" said Hannah. They're gonna need someone to look after them." "Yes, she's right," said Prudy. "Children mustn't be left without supervision." "I'll put an ad in the newspaper right away," said Gertrude. "That won't be necessary," said Hannah. "I'd like to volunteer for the job." Gertrude and Prudy looked at her with surprise. "But you're not well educated," said Gertrude. "How will you teach the children about economics?" "And you're not very glamorous," said Prudy. "How will the children look up to you?" "I think I'll manage," said Hannah. "Don't you agree, children?" With a great roar of joy, the children agreed. And there and then, Hannah Tender was declared the new matron of the Hopeton Orphanage. And what of the soot-smeared Switch? The Miss Switch who had once been so beautiful and terrifying? She seemed to have deflated completely. As she stood there staring at the hall full of embracing adults and children, she felt utterly unimportant. The sheriff took her by the arm and led her away, and none of the orphans ever saw her face again. And as beautiful and villainous as Angelica Switch had become, she looked in that moment more like the ugly little orphan she had once been, alone and ignored. Chapter 32, on Endings. Writers, philosophers, and great-aunts have said a great many things about endings. Things like, "All's well that ends well," and "Every end is a new beginning," and "When you close a door, you open a window." But when endings happen to people in real life, no one gives much thought to all ending well or new beginnings or doors and windows. This is because people's lives are far too untidy for real endings and beginnings. It is better, perhaps, to simply say what happened. The nibblers that floated above the Hopeton Orphanage that first night were sweeter than they had ever been. The moth zoomed and creamed and twirled about, drinking in the wild and delicious flavors until the sun came up. Then they fluttered contentedly back to their tree, hiccuping and dizzy. And from that night on, the story of the greatest game was told again and again, with new heroic details added at every telling. Hannah became a very good matron, just as you might have supposed. Her first order of business was the pets, who were raving hysterically about a monster in the hallway, and whom Hannah sent straight to bed with cold compresses. Then, Switch's hoard of treasures was sold, and the money was used to buy the clothes and books and toys that the poor trusting mailman thought he'd been delivering all along. Mush was banned from the menu, and the orphans were at last given some education, though not so much as to put them to sleep. Every so often, Hannah did pay a visit to her old schoolmate Angelica. She was the only visitor Switch ever had, and it was hard, at first, to find anything to talk about. But slowly, as time went by, Hannah began to recognize her old friend again. The bleach grew out of Switch's hair, and her makeup didn't seem as heavy as before. While Hannah was never quite sure if her visits were wholly welcome, over time Switch's rude remarks did seem to lessen. Eventually, the two of them could sit together, if not comfortably, at least cordially. And the life of Margaret Gray, which had once been so quiet and unusual, became more like other children's lives. As soon as the other orphans didn't have to pretend she was invisible, Margaret made friends. There were still unpleasant people like Lacey to deal with, but they lost their taste for bullying somewhat when they had found their bad behavior now earned them extra chores. Hello! Welcome, welcome! How are you? Welcome from Brazil. Margaret's world became louder than it had ever been. After 10 years without any brothers or sisters, she now had lots of people to shout and scream and holler with. And as Hannah encouraged outdoor games on fine afternoons, there was a lot of hollering to be had. If this were a proper world, Margaret would have surely gained all those delightful things and still would have been able to keep the good parts of her old life. Her retreats to the Moth Tree would have been filled with the happiness that spilled from her everyday life. But no one can live between two worlds forever, however much they'd like to. The more friends Margaret made, the more she ran and played and laughed, the harder it was for her to hear the tiny sounds that used to come so easily to her. And though she still snuck off every night to visit the moths, their voices were growing quieter and quieter. One afternoon, as the orphans were whooping through the yard in a loud game of tag, a car pulled up on the dusty road, and from inside came a kind-looking woman and a man with a warm smile. Within an hour, Margaret's life had taken a very wonderful new turn. A few moments later, her cheeks aching from so many smiles, Margaret ran as fast as she could up to the moth tree. "Pip," she called as she rushed inside. "Pip, wake up! I've been adopted!" Pip fluttered sleepily down from the upper branches of the tree and dropped into the palm of Margaret's open hand. "By parents?" he cried. "Yes!" cried Margaret. Margaret beamed, and Pip congratulated, and it was the happiest either of them had ever been. "You'll come, won't you?" said Margaret, after a minute. "You'll come live in town, too?" "Oh," said Pip, "but Margaret, I couldn't live in a town." "What do you mean?" said Margaret. "Of course you could. It could be like an adventure." "An awfully big one," Pip said, and his voice was so quiet that the blowing of the wind almost blocked it out. Margaret opened her mouth to argue, but then she looked at her friend and saw, for the very first time in a long time, just how small of a creature he was. And then her throat felt very tight. It is an inconvenient thing, in moments when you most need to tell someone something, that your eyes begin to burn and words seem to get stuck in your throat. Margaret wanted to tell Pip many things, about he and the moths had saved them all, how, if not for them, she would have a very different life, and how she could only manage to say one thing. "I'll remember you always," said Margaret. "You're my first friend." She could barely hear Pip's next words, and she had to concentrate every bit of her energy on her ears, just to make them out. When she did, they were barely louder than the rustle of the leaves. "And you're my Margaret." She looked down at the small gray creature in her hand, and he looked up at her. Leaning forward, she gave him a soft kiss on the tip of his wing, and he tilted his head to her. Then he did 3 fantastic loop-de-loops in the air and flew up into the treetop. When Margaret crawled through the bush and out into the day, she ran into the open arms of her new parents. They drove away down the dusty road away from the orphanage, away from the waving orphans and Hannah's smiling face, and away from the tree that held Margaret's secret. And that was the first day of what would be a very loving and wonderful life. But whenever Margaret saw a pair of tiny wings flutter by, or the touched bark of a gnarled old tree, she thought of her first friend. Whenever she felt lonely or sad, she would go to a green place, away from the clatter and noise of the city. She would close her eyes and stay very still, and she would listen. And sometimes, very far off, she could swear she could hear the laughing voices of the moths. the end of the book. Yeah, how did you guys enjoy it? I think it's my favorite book. I think it holds that place as my favorite book. But I hope you all enjoyed. If I haven't put you to sleep. Which I very well may have done. I thank you all for joining. I'm gonna end it here. I hope you all have a very wonderful day. Get some rest if you need it. And I hope your day is good. And if you listen very closely, maybe you could hear the moths too.